Hey guys, Mr. Ridgway here for our next episode for DCUSH. Today we're going to be looking at the invention of rock and roll, or as it's called here, remixed R&B. As you'll see, that is a very, very intentional title. So what we're going to be doing here through rock and roll is looking at basically a criticism of the 1950s, because rock and roll can be very subversive. It can kind of like bend cultural norms, and especially talking about all the conformity in the 1950s, you're going to definitely see how that is true. So let's get started. Alright, so our essential questions here. With rock and roll, a big part of it is, like any kind of music, is kind of like where cultural influences come from. So does music better reflect cultural bridging or cultural appropriation, like theft? And this is kind of a big question, like when, at what time do certain groups of people own a certain kind of music? Okay, and also how does music respond to the context of its time? Because music, just like any other kind of art form, is in some ways not only talking about the past or maybe things that have happened before, but it's really kind of like responding to what's going on in the present. Okay, cool. Before you get started, what I'd like you to do, or before we go on here, is I'd like you to read this short article by historians Tyndall and Shai, and it's about kids in the 1950s. And really what I'd like you to look at is like looking at who were considered to be the rebellious teenagers in the 1950s. I'd like you to answer two questions on your notes. Number one, how prevalent was this rebelliousness across society? And then number two, why do you think this kind of rebelliousness was occurring? And maybe you can think about the 1950s and what was being emphasized and might give that kind of rebelliousness a good need to exist. All right, so go ahead and read that article, answer both of those questions, and then once you're ready, continue on. Okay, so what is rock and roll? Rock and roll, very simply, as just a music definition, is a blending of R&B and country music. Okay, R&B, if you don't know, is rhythm and blues, but let's talk about the actual term, because again, the term and how we define these things is kind of an important thing as to like who owns a certain kind of music. Okay, so where does the word rock and roll come from? It actually comes from that guy down there. His name is Alan Freed. He was a Cleveland, Ohio disc jockey, not exactly, it wasn't just Alan Freed, it was another guy who owned a particular record store. But what Alan Freed was able to do, okay, is that he, after going and visiting a few kind of stores, one particular store owner said like, hey, like white kids come into my store, like my record store, because those used to be a thing, and they listened to this race music, which is what they called at that time black people's music. They called it race music, and like I gotta sell these records. And so what Alan Freed and this particular store owner do is they're like, okay, so like we have to market this to a white audience. So what do we do with all these R&B records that we need to get rid of? And so what they do then is they come up with this term like rock and roll. And by taking this, basically this genre that already existed and renaming it for a white audience, they're able to kind of cross over the racial barrier. And so that's basically where rock and roll, that term comes from. Now, it is kind of something to note as well that rock and roll is actually, at that time, it was a black euphemism used for dancing and sex. Okay, so it kind of like, in some ways, it kind of makes sense with why it was given, but then also it's kind of like good to be aware of this, like, oh, so Alan Freed was trying to do this in order to kind of market to an audience that didn't exist before. Okay, now, and this is where things get a lot more controversial, because with any kind of music, there's a question of like, okay, are you like borrowing something from somewhere else, or are you just straight up stealing it? And something to note is very similarly to rap music. Okay, rock and roll becomes popular in white audiences, and white teenagers especially. Okay, the number one consumers of rap music today are actually white kids. Okay, now it does kind of like that. Rock and roll becomes popular once white artists start taking it and producing it. Okay, and that's kind of like the question. So like, is this an example of just simply borrowing? Kind of like more kind of like on the racial kind of like unity or kind of like, acknowledging kind of side, or is this just straight up kind of like taking somebody else's music, making it your own, and then just profiting off of it? And I want to show you a couple of videos here that might kind of like make you think a little bit about this. So what I've done here is I put a song that was either written or really became famous through famous as in like became known for that person, a black artist who was doing this song, okay? And then I've put an arrow next to the white artist who then went and popularized this song for white audiences. And this is kind of the question, is this cultural bridging or is it cultural appropriation? So what I'd like you to do is listen to Fats Domino, Pat Boone, okay? Now, notice, again, the songs here, and Big Mama Thornton called Hound Dog, and then Elvis Presley in his song, Hound Dog. So, the question is then, whose music is rock and roll? I don't know if we exactly have a good answer for that. Okay, why was rock and roll for the 1950s subversive? Okay, let's look how popular at that time, what popular audiences thought of rock and roll, and I mean popular as in the parents who were in charge and what they saw as it challenging conformity. Okay, so much of traditional society, as this is said here, did not see rock and roll as positive or appropriate. Okay, so a few events here that I'll read you. This is from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In 1955, 15,000 letters, mostly written by young adults, are sent to Chicago rock stations accusing them of playing dirty records. Newspaper editorials promise that the stations will censor themselves of all controversial music, especially rhythm and blues, in other words, black music. Okay, so that's in 1955. 1957, Elvis Presley performs in the Ed Sullivan Show and is filmed only from the waist up because his dancing is seemed indecent. And if you'd like to see a video of that, you can click right here and check that out. Okay, 1958 drops all rock and roll records. One broadcasting system does from its network music, calling it distorted, monotonous, noisy music. And this one's kind of like a really interesting one. Link Wray's instrumental classic Rumble doesn't even have words, is banned from radio stations across the U.S. The title of the song is thought to be suggestive of teenage gang violence. When Ray performs on American Bandstand, which was kind of like a big kind of like television primetime news show, Dick Clark introduces him but doesn't say the title of the song. Kind of some really interesting, like, seeing how the dominant culture at the time was really interpreting rock and roll. All right, now the last thing I want to show you is how rock and roll can serve as political criticism. Okay, so rock and roll, besides in the 1950s being very culturally subversive, it could definitely extend to express political opinions. Okay, and what I'd like you to do is pull up the lyrics right here to Bruce Springsteen's "Born in the USA." Okay, now what's really interesting about this song, okay, and you're going to listen to it, just you can click here on the album cover, okay, and please read the lyrics as you go on, is that this is always like the #1 song played on July 4th. If you go to Spotify and go to like I almost going to guarantee you it's true. If you go to like Spotify and go to like the top 100 in the US, like around July 3rd, July 4th, you'll see this song makes like #1 or #2 on that list. And what I'd like you to see in here is actually how dark and how like anti-US this song actually is. And most people like don't have like the critical lens to actually like sit and like listen to the lyrics and understand like what it's trying to suggest. So I'll kind of give you a brief taste here. Again, like I'd pause it before you listen to me kind of read this, so that way, I don't kind of spoil it for you. Okay, so basically, I'll summarize the lyrics here. He talks about as a kid, like life was really tough. Okay, so he's born in the USA, born in the USA, born in the USA. Got in a little hometown jam, so he goes and joins the army. They send him off to a foreign land to go and kill the yellow man. And that's Vietnam, probably. Okay, was what he's suggesting there. Okay, then he says, I come back home to the refinery. Hiring man said, son, if it were up to me, went down to see my VA man, it's Veterans Affairs man. He said, son, you don't understand. So he comes back home. There's no jobs. He goes to the VA for help, and the VA can't help him either. Really rough. He says, then he keeps going. I had a brother at Khe Sanh, that's in Vietnam, fighting off the Viet Cong. They're still there, and he's all gone. So also his friend is dead. Okay, now down in the shadow of the penitentiary, out by the gas fires of the refinery, I'm 10 years burning down the road, nowhere to run, ain't got nowhere to go. So now he's like talking about, okay, I'm either, he says, like, down in the shadow of the penitentiary. He's like, either he's in prison or he's nearby it. He's got like no future and nowhere to run, but nowhere to go. It's a really, really dark message that Bruce Springsteen is kind of trying to show here. So again, rock and roll can be really culturally subversive and very political at the same time. So I hope this was a good introduction to kind of showing you how rock and roll is kind of critiquing the conformity of the 1950s. And that's all I've got for you in this video lesson. Okay, so I'll see you guys until next time. Bye-bye.